Hi everyone, I'm Stephanie Pinay. Today I'd like to talk about forgiveness. There's a lot of misunderstandings about what forgiveness is, and certainly A Course in Miracles definition of forgiveness is very different from the world's definition of forgiveness. But before we get into that, I'd like to start with the inspiration for making this particular episode. I was listening to a video of an interview with Neko Case, who is a musician I really admire, love much of her music, and I've also been reading part of her memoir. The book is called The Harder I Fight, The More I Love You. And without going into detail, the book shows how neglected she was in her upbringing, physically, emotionally, education-wise. Her parents kind of really dropped the bag when it came to providing what every child is expected to have. Now, in this interview on Identified podcast, she said the following: I live with my dad mostly. My mum wasn't into having a kid. She would kind of pretend she was into it and then vanish. She'd go through the motions of being loving but not committed and not into it. It was like a role she was playing, and you felt that as a kid. I believed her some of the time. I worshipped her. I thought she was so beautiful and kind. People really liked her. That's not who she was though. That was her mask. She did play mum for a second and then be like, nah. It was like that my whole childhood. I finally just said, go to hell, please. So that was the end of that short on YouTube. And then I saw another interview with Neko Case on a podcast called Modern Love. In it, Neko was explaining why she selected the essay My Mother, the Stranger by Caitlin McCormick to read on the podcast. And this is what she had to say after reading the essay. This person is desperate to find forgiveness for their mother, whereas I am not. And I have a very different view of forgiveness. And I think that it is a really sacred, amazing thing. But in certain situations, it's also a total crock and a responsibility that should not be put on someone who's already gone through so much. You do not have to forgive people if it's hard work for you. It's something you find if you're lucky. Forgiveness is beautiful, the real thing. It's kind of like the concept of justice. It's flaunted a lot, but it's like forgiveness and justice are not one thing. They're kind of an atmosphere, and they're a state of being that's very organic and alive. It's not a thing you reach and then you're there and then you're good. It's like it has to be a systemic, healthy thing. And that's the end of the quote. Now, I just like to unpack some of what I think Neko is meaning. When she says that if forgiving someone is hard work for you, you shouldn't have to do it, and that forgiveness is something you find if you're lucky. Now, I think she has a point here in that we shouldn't push ourselves to try and forgive someone. If it's work for us to do it, then efforts are directed the wrong way. And when she said, if it's something you find if you're lucky, I can see that she's saying, she appreciates the experience that someone has when they forgive someone. It's like, what is it that people think is so great about forgiveness? Well, you'd say there's no more hatred. There's no more invasions of the past in your mind, in your current life. It's like a weight lifted off your shoulders. So yes, it is something beautiful. And if you experience it, you are lucky. And so I think Neko does appreciate what forgiveness is. However, to push it onto someone and say that you need to forgive this person, well, that's the kind of attitude or forgiveness that she's balking at. And here, I think this is where the common understanding of forgiveness, what forgiveness is the problem. Because if you think that forgiveness is forgiving what somebody has done and the way they have treated you, then you are going to kind of rebel against that idea of forgiveness. Because let's face it, we do perceive a hierarchy of grievances, a hierarchy of wrongs done. Some things can seem, not much to forgive, whereas other things can seem huge to forgive. If we're looking on the basis of form and what is done to our bodies, to our psychology, to our personality, or how it affects that. And this is what we'll be discussing in this podcast. I'll be reading from sections from my book, Above the Battleground, The Courageous Path to Emotional Autonomy and Inner Peace. The thing about this book is I wrote it for people who are unfamiliar with A Course in Miracles. So there are 3 sections to the book, and we don't actually get into anything about A Course in Miracles until the 3rd section on healing. So before we do that, there's a lot of discussion about shame and what that is and how that manifests, about guilt. There's a lot of discussion about upbringing and how that affects us, Carl Jung's theory of personality development and wholeness and how that relates to a spiritual instinct as well. But then the 3rd part is on forgiveness and the Course's view of forgiveness. And there's a reason why it's in the 3rd part. Because you can't deny how we do see things, which is what the first part of the book is about. And the second part of the book also said that kind of bridges into the 3rd. So the Course's idea of forgiveness links a little bit more to what Neko is saying in the final part of the interview, where she says this: forgiveness is beautiful, the real thing. It's kind of like the concept of justice. It's flaunted a lot, but it's like forgiveness and justice are not one thing. They're kind of an atmosphere, and they're a state of being that's very organic and alive. It's not a thing you reach and then you're there and then you're good. It's like it has to be a systemic, healthy thing. So what I think she's expressing here in my interpretation is that it's not a forced thing. It's like forgiveness happens to you, and that she talks about that kind of an atmosphere and a state of being that's very organic and alive. And I think that talks beautifully about the kind of forgiveness in A Course in Miracles and the experience of it. And when we talk about the miracle in relationship to forgiveness, we're talking about the kind of forgiveness that comes about not through working hard at getting over or overlooking all the things, the horrible things that have been done to us. It's not about that. So with all of this in mind, I'll read out the sections of my book relating to forgiveness, and I'll probably refer back to Neko's thoughts, but I'll also be including the experience of Jelena Dokic, who was a tennis player in Australia, and she had a very abusive father. And the experience of Jelena Dokic was another inspiration for doing this podcast, because as I was reflecting on what Neko has said, in the news today in Australia, I saw an article about Jelena and her experience with her father, Demir, who was extremely abusive towards her during her tennis career and in her early childhood. Well, it just so happens that when I was writing so many years ago, around about 2018, writing this section in Above the Battleground on forgiveness, when I was writing part of it, I was thinking of Jelena and her experience with her father. So I'll point out that particular passage as I'm reading it and how it relates to her story. I'll start reading now. It's from chapter 6 in Above the Battleground. The subtitle is The Problem of Forgiveness. The concept of forgiveness is currently enjoying popularity in psychology. You won't find a therapist who hasn't observed a link between holding grievances and stress. However, our ideas about forgiveness can be very problematic. In an ABC News investigation into the relationship between religion and domestic violence, problems within the traditional Christian concept of forgiveness were clear. Reviewing 200 interviews with domestic violence survivors, social workers, clergy, church staff and theologians, researchers found many women had been told to simply forgive and return to abusive husbands, which led to enduring further violent behaviour. This view of forgiveness looks at behaviour and says, no, we don't condone it. It is terrible, even evil, and yes, you have endured much harm because of it. Then it's suggested that the victim simply let go of the pain and anger, which sounds just as reasonable as asking them to pull a rabbit out of a hat. Yet it is this magic trick that commonly goes by the name of forgiveness. This is why Freud referred to the New Testament credo, love thine enemies as credo quia absurdum, or I believe it because it's absurd. To Freud, it is impossible to love someone or forgive them if we feel they have diminished us in some way, and so striving to fulfill the love command can only lead to more shame and guilt. Pretending otherwise is an exercise in denial, leaving the door open for our fears and anger to be expressed in more destructive and seemingly unrelated ways. The essential point is that we can't move beyond blame and anger if we feel damaged by someone. Likewise, the only way we can rise above unkind treatment is if we don't take it personally, and for this, we need a miracle. Subtitle: The Miracle. A defining feature of A Course in Miracles is the way it flips traditional biblical terms on their head, giving them radically different meanings. This is the case for the Course's use of the word miracle. The Oxford Dictionary defines miracle as an extraordinary event that's not explicable by scientific laws and is therefore attributed to a divine agency. There are no less than 37 miracles of this type performed by Jesus in the Bible. In contrast, the miracle in A Course in Miracles is only concerned with our state of mind, not external events. The Course's meaning relates to its central goal, to help us experience inner peace, otherwise expressed as knowing the wholeness and holiness of our spiritual self. It's about healing shame and guilt, which ultimately stem from feeling separate from God. As we've seen earlier in the book, this sense of separation is the source of all our insecurity and emotional neediness. The miracle addresses this sense of estrangement from God indirectly. That's important. Indirectly, by undoing the shame and guilt associated with events, people, and circumstances. The miracle is when we're no longer haunted by the past or fearful of the future, but feel peace in the present instead. So that, to me, is linking back to what Neko Case said about forgiveness, that it's kind of an atmosphere, a state of being that is very organic and alive. It's a systemic, healthy thing. I think she really, to me, has a good grasp of what forgiveness is, what its experience would be. And she's right in that it shouldn't require, or doesn't, real forgiveness doesn't require hammering ourselves with the task of forgive this person, forgive this person. The forgiveness process, as we'll see with A Course in Miracles, we work on our relationship with one person when we work on it with anybody else. So that person that we're really struggling to forgive, it is okay to not focus on them. It is amazing how if you apply the Course's forgiveness to every situation in your life, in your daily life, not excluding anything, if you can remember to do that, how issues, really painful issues from the past, yes, they can surface and then they can go and then they can, but eventually they can drop by the wayside sometimes without a direct effort to kind of whittle them away. Okay, carrying on. The miracle is when we're no longer haunted by the past or fearful of the future, but feel peace in the present instead. It's when we feel at one with ourselves and others, an earthly reflection of heaven's oneness. It can indeed feel miraculous when we no longer identify with shame and guilt, when what used to press our buttons no longer affects us and we don't feel at odds with the world. It's as if the dark past, unworthy self-concept and associated fears never existed. People might even remark on how much we've changed. This is the miracle A Course in Miracles is about. It's a quote from the Course. This was the ego, the brotherless illusion and the self that seemed alone in all the universe. This terrible mistake about yourself, the miracle corrects as gently as a loving mother sings her child to rest. End of quote. I just want to point out this part of that quote. This terrible mistake about yourself, the miracle corrects. So in the Course's view, all unforgiveness or feelings that other people have hurt you and mistreated you and you cannot get over that really, that your hatred for them in doing that, really behind that is a terrible mistake about yourself. behind those feelings of hatred for the other person is a terrible mistake about yourself. And I think of Neko saying how she loved and adored her mother. Her mother was beautiful and everybody loved her and she could be so kind. Well, that is all the more hurtful if that person then all of a sudden treats you like you're nothing. It suggests something to us. We conclude something about ourselves. That's a terrible mistake about yourself. And that is the source of our grief. And that is the source of our resistance to getting close even to those issues associated with that other person. The pain is immense. But underlying that pain, and another part of our resistance, is that there is that whole, perfect spiritual self and that love. And that is also a part of our resistance to connecting with that issue, with that person. But again, we needn't force ourselves to go to places that we're not ready to go to. The Course's path is gentle and kind. There will be other ways to work on our shame and guilt, on the terrible mistake we've made about ourselves. The world will provide us with ways that we are able to cope with as we go along. If our goal is healing, and I don't mean healing that relationship. Again, you don't have to focus on that. I mean healing yourself, healing the depression, the anxiety. And as the Course says, it's a growth in willingness. It's a growth in willingness to see people's mistakes as mistakes and errors and not sins. It's a growth in willingness to not condemn them to hell. Unfortunately, as Neko said, I finally just said, go to hell, please, Okay, I will continue on. Subtitle: Forgiveness Redefined. And here's another quote from the Course. Belief that there is another way of perceiving is the loftiest idea of which ego thinking is capable. That is because it contains a hint of recognition that the ego is not the self. End of quote. So believing there is another way of perceiving. So instead of perceiving what somebody did as an attack, an attack on your value, and therefore feeling defensive and that you have to attack back by hating them and condemning them, you can see it as a call for help. But again, this can take time, and life will provide you other ways to start to lessen your identification with shame and guilt, so that eventually you might come to a place, without having to focus on that particular person, you might come to a place where you do start to feel better about that person, or a little bit more, inverted commas, forgiving. Carrying on. Forgiveness is the expression of the miracle, the process whereby we undo our sense of unworthiness. Detailed steps will be introduced in the next chapter of the book, but the following provides an overview of the main supporting concepts. The Course's forgiveness revolves around the premise that we're never upset by a fact, but by our interpretation of it. This is also a major tenet of Stoic philosophy and Albert Ellis's rational emotive behaviour therapy, the forerunner to cognitive behaviour therapy. It's not our circumstances, but our interpretation of them that disturbs or excites us. If someone belittles us, for example, the anger or fear we feel is because they've triggered feelings of inferiority or guilt. Therefore, forgiveness isn't achieved by trying to overlook what someone has done after deciding it is the cause of our pain, but by addressing the shame and guilt associated with it. When we identify with the ego or false self, shame and guilt become our companions. Needy and insecure, we feel dependent on things outside ourselves to decrease our anxiety. And since no one and nothing can make up for our insecurities, we are destined to feel let down. We'll then blame our suffering on others, developing an if only orientation. If only they were more supportive, more loving, more successful, we would feel better, we think. This if only orientation is a mark of ego identification. Now, of course, as children, we don't have the luxury of being able to look after ourselves. and not being dependent on people who might not be treating us that well or who might not be reflecting to us our true value. If they've got an ego, they will be unkind to us at times, as we will to anybody. But yeah, as children, the ego has done a really good setup in this world because it makes us so dependent as children, and our brain literally hasn't got the capacity to see things from a larger perspective. And so as children, we will take everything so personally. And so the process of life is an undoing as we become older of all those things we believed about ourselves and about others as we were growing up. The ego's master plan, it's pretty good to have us born into a world where we're so vulnerable and impressionable that we have some very heavy lessons ingrained about us and about others and about the world and what it can offer us and what it can't, that then all have to be undone later on. And that's quite a process itself. And that's where we need help. We need help from outside the world and its program to undo those beliefs. And that's where the miracle comes in. Carrying on. The ego in the Course differs from the general psychological term in that it refers to our belief in and attachment to our separate existence to God. Ego identification is maintained by believing that the answer to our lack of peace lies outside our mind, which means if we blame others for our distress, the ego retains its hold. It also means our solution, our defensive solution. So in this book, I talk about particular solutions that the psychoanalyst Karen Horney came up with to protect us from shame and guilt. Some of us are more shame-prone, some of us are more guilt-prone, and so the defensive solutions that we adopt will be different. Yes, it also means our solution retains its hold because our demands are based on fulfilling its needs. Here's a quote from the Course. The past is the ego's chief learning device, for it is in the past that ye learn to define your own needs and acquired methods for meeting them on your own terms. So growing up as a child, vulnerable, afraid, but hugely dependent on others, we defend ourselves, we take on a system of defense, a kind of character armor that we think will protect us. We may be overly pleasing, we may be defiant to get attention, we might become detached and super self-efficient so that we don't need others. These are all defenses to feeling vulnerable, whether it be emotionally vulnerable, physically vulnerable, or all of the above. The Course calls the relationships designed to fulfill our defensive needs special relationships. They are special in that they're exclusive, reflecting the idea that a special person, project, or thing can give us something important that no one or nothing else can. This leads to an incredible dependency on some people and a dismissive attitude towards others. Our lives then emphasise separation and differentiation, the destruction of oneness, which leads to more guilt and loneliness. In short, special relationships are a substitute for a relationship with God and our spiritual self. Referring back to the previous chapter's discussion of overvaluing our parents as gods, every special relationship involves such an overvaluation because we look to it to meet our neediness. However, the relationship can be used to undo ego identification through forgiveness, thus becoming what the Course calls a holy relationship. A special relationship becomes holy when we don't use it to protect us from shame and guilt, when we don't use it as a substitute for a relationship with God. Forgiveness leads to a sense of freedom because it affirms that our peace doesn't depend on things outside our control. We can be in the world but not of it. This is why the Course says forgiveness is the key to happiness. And here's a quote from the Course. What could you want forgiveness cannot give? Do you want peace? Forgiveness offers it. Do you want happiness? A quiet mind, a certainty of purpose, and a sense of worth and beauty that transcends the world. Do you want care and safety and the warmth of sure protection always? Do you want a quietness that cannot be disturbed, a gentleness that can never be hurt, a deep abiding comfort, and a rest so perfect it can never be upset? All this forgiveness offers you and more. End of quote. So I'd just like to point out that the discussion about special relationships here is relevant to forgiveness because if we do have a grievance that is still affecting us, then we will have a need to take vengeance, what the Course says, take vengeance on the past and act out those grievances on other significant people in our lives, and also get from them what we didn't get from those people that we accuse. So if there is an issue at hand, unfortunately, there is no way of saying go to hell and I will never, ever forgive you for that or get over that or stop hating you or something like that. If that is our stance, that issue is kind of going to bleed into every other facet of our lives, and it's going to affect other people because we'll be projecting a whole lot of special love and special hate onto them. In a way, we're carrying that tie to that person. We're still bound to them. I think the Course uses the word, what does it say? Oh yeah, jailers. If you keep that person in jail, you have to be the jailer to keep them there. So you're limited as well. You're stuck in jail as well. So even though you might be off doing other things with other people, you're actually still in jail. You will be manifesting that relationship or projecting it in other ways throughout your entire life. Okay, so how do we do this type of forgiveness that I'm talking about, where it's just so intense? And like Neko said, if you have to work hard at it, then you shouldn't have to do it. And I agree with her. If you're at a point where it's like, it would be too much hard work to forgive this person, you don't do the forgiveness. The forgiveness is done for you when you're able to open your mind up to just no longer hating that person. Are you willing to free them? And the Course works at motivation. It tries to let us know that we would feel better if we opened our mind to the possibility that we could no longer hate this person, or that we could no longer have a desire to hold a picture of this person up to the world to let them know how bad they are. When we realise that that kind of behaviour is condemning ourselves to a life of misery, then we can be willing to engage in the process, in the Course's process of forgiveness, which I'm not going to get into now because that's not the purpose of this podcast, to go through the steps of forgiveness. It's more to talk about forgiveness as it can occur without actually focusing on that person who is the object of your hate. So here we go. Subtitle, Keeping It Real. Another defining feature of the Course's forgiveness is that it only refers to a process in the mind. We don't, therefore, have to physically reconcile. Forgiveness relates to an attitude, not to behaviour. It is possible, for example, that through the process of forgiveness, we decide to end contact with someone or file a lawsuit, but this won't be done with hatred. Unfortunately, what generally passes for forgiveness fails to make this distinction between attitude and behaviour and is anything but a healing process. For a guilt-prone person or a people-pleaser in a relationship with someone who's adopted an extreme form of the aggressive solution, for example, it might be impossible to achieve a compromise in which their own needs are considered. There's no middle ground for extreme aggressive types. It's their way, all the way, or nothing at all. Okay, I'll stop here. The inspiration for writing that bit was Jelena Dokic. At the time when I was writing, Jelena was talking about how she had tried to reconcile with her father, how she had visited him, and he had just started hurling more abuse at her. And so she left. And she realised that she could not have a mutually respectful relationship with him in form. It just wasn't going to happen. Jelena Dokic was an incredibly abusive man. Okay, carrying on. In such cases, the guilt-prone person's forgiveness process might call for them to leave a relationship, perhaps reflecting a realisation that they're not responsible for their partner's happiness, that they're capable of surviving outside of the relationship, and that they have a right to be happy. So with Jelena Dokic, she talks about how her father put her down a lot of physical abuse, a lot of emotional abuse right from an early age. And in the end, she says in this article that I read just this morning, she said, forgiving Demir is a step that she hasn't been able to take. But here's the big thing, she says, I do not hate him, and that's important. And I would say, I don't know what Jelena's definition of forgiveness is, but I would say that since she does not hate him, she most likely has forgiven him. I'll keep reading and you'll probably understand what I'm getting at. As we heal our identification with shame and guilt, we'll no longer experience hatred or fear toward the person we thought had diminished us, or perhaps we'll no longer think of them at all. This reminds me of this part in the news article. It says that Jelena Dokic, he was 67, died in May this year. Jelena did not go to his funeral, and this is what she said. I didn't feel like I needed to or wanted to go. I kind of feel like that's the end of that chapter, she says firmly. It's the end. It's done. And I think that's a nice way of describing her resolution of her relationship with her dad. She doesn't hate him. She didn't feel a need to go to his funeral, which would have been going back to Yugoslavia. She now lives in Australia. So I think that nicely describes what we're talking about here. I'll just reread that last sentence. As we heal our identification with shame and guilt, we'll no longer experience hatred or fear toward the person we thought had diminished us, or perhaps we'll no longer think of them at all. This point is especially significant for survivors of severe interpersonal trauma, including physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, especially in the early stages of therapy. For many people, forgiveness happens over time, but it is not the focus of therapy. Processing the trauma, reassessing beliefs about the self, and learning to function well again in the world are the means for moving on. In this regard, we can say forgiveness is a state in which we are no longer at the mercy of intruding thoughts about the event or the person, nor do we blame them for how we are feeling now. While the idea that it's our interpretations that upset us rather than things themselves is central to forgiveness, we can fall into denial if we believe we shouldn't become disturbed by anything. Importantly, the first step in forgiveness is to acknowledge our hurt, pain, and anger. The invitation is to then avoid justifying an ongoing attachment to our judgments. This is usually something we can only bring ourselves to consider after some time. The road to this ideal requires work and is a process. It's also why we need help of a transcendent order. And the chapter goes on to talk about the help that we get. And that is the help, or one of the forms it talks about, is the help of the Holy Spirit. So in the Course's system, the Holy Spirit is the aspect of our mind that is connected to the memory of our whole spiritual self. So as we ask for help from the Holy Spirit to see from its perspective, it will help us see that we are not the shameful, guilty creature that we imagined ourselves to be, and the other person's actions came from anxiety, depression. They also were a call for help. Unfortunately, what tends to happen is adults project their own issues onto children, their own childhood issues onto children. The Course tells us that it's for our innocence that we yearn. So even though we appear to be born into the world a blank slate, we're not. We actually have, in the deep recesses of the unconscious, we have that identification with shame and guilt stemming from our belief in a separation from God. And then as we're treated by our significant others, that self-concept can just build and build and build. And then the adult who is full of shame and guilt, but yearning for their innocence, then projects that shame and guilt and that hatred, that self-hatred, onto the most convenient symbol of innocence around them, their own child. And so it goes. So I think of all the inner child workshops. I guess they're still popular. They were very popular in the 90s, where people are getting in touch with the hurts and concerns of their inner child and giving voice to things perhaps that they haven't before. A Course in Miracles talks about protecting the sacred child within, the child with a capital C, the child that is innocent, the child that is our spiritual self, the child that longs for home, and home being an experience of oneness, which means not feeling alone in the world, not feeling an alien, not feeling other, but also not perceiving others that way either. And that's why the Course says, cast no one out from that circle of love. Because if you do, you'll believe that the door to heaven is barred to you as well. So perhaps when it comes to those really, really tricky situations of forgiveness, the ones that cause you the most pain, we can think of another section in the Course called the Rules for Decision, where instead of focusing on trying to overcome those feelings and hammer at your hatred of that person and try to break down the boulder of hatred with an axe, you can think of it this way. Do I like how I am feeling now? At least I can decide I do not like what I feel now. And so I hope I have been wrong. I want another way to look at this. Perhaps there is another way to look at this. What can I lose by asking? And then leave it be. Leave it be. It's just that gentle, gentle opening of the mind. Perhaps I'm wrong. Maybe I'd be better off if I was wrong, because right now I don't feel good in the way I perceive things, and I'm tired of feeling that way. Maybe there's another way of perceiving things. That just opens your mind a little bit to the influence of that memory of the Holy Spirit that is the link to the memory of your wholeness, of your whole spiritual self. And that can provide an influence beyond any words, beyond any physical therapist in the world, that can gently help you let go of whatever seems to be imprisoning you in your pain. And that influence can come in different ways. It might be that you're guided to turn on the television and, wow, there's an interview that strikes at the heart of what you're going through. Or maybe you have a dream. Or maybe you start a project on something totally unrelated, but somehow that experience works out something for you in relation to this other person. You don't need to know. You just need the willingness to be wrong, for there to be another way about how to perceive everything, because that is the opening to perceiving yourself differently, to perceiving yourself as something other than an ego, as the Course says. Opening your mind to the idea that there is another way of perceiving things is the loftiest thing that an ego can possibly do, because it entails the idea that the ego is not the self. I hope this has been of help to you, and remember that healing can come from many different directions and avenues. Don't hammer yourself with a direct line to that person or that issue that is bothering you. You don't know how you might be helped from any number of angles. You don't need to keep that focus on that person or issue, because ultimately every issue is the same. Thank you very much for listening. Tune in again. Bye.